Welcome to my channel. Today we'll talk about PSM1 practice questions. We'll see first 20 questions. Question 1. During the sprint, the developers struggle to understand a functional requirement related to a new feature. Some work has already been completed, but the item is not done. What should the Scrum Master do in this situation? So we have options: cancel the sprint, suspend the sprint until the developers understand all functional requirements, ask the product owner to accept the partial work and to move the remaining work to the next sprint, coach the developers to collaborate with the product owner until the functional requirement is understood. I'm holding this video for 1 minute. This is the time for you to think before we see the actual answer. So answer is coach the developers to collaborate with the product owner until the functional requirement is understood. As Scrum Master, main responsibility is to coach and facilitate the team. In spite of taking any other action regarding this, he'll coach the developers, try to understand the requirements from the product owner once more, and make the item as done. Next question. Scrum mandates that every Scrum team to have Scrum Master and a product owner. Options are true. The Scrum Master and the product owner must be available 100% of the time. True, the Scrum Master and the product owner must be available for the rest of the Scrum team. The result of the entire Scrum team depend on their availability. True, to reduce costs and be more efficient, a single person should handle both accountabilities. False, the Scrum Master is only available during the kickoff phase of the project. So this is the time for you to think before we move to answer. Answer is true. The Scrum Master and Product Owner must be available for the rest of the team. The result of the entire Scrum team depends on their availability. Scrum Master and Product Owner are not optional. Let's move to question 3. Development organization decided to add another Scrum team to an existing Scrum team already developing a product. How will this affect the short-term performance of the current Scrum team? The options are the performance will increase, performance will decrease, performance will stay the same. Answer is the performance will decrease. In the short term, the performance will most likely decrease as the existing team will need to invest some additional time to collaborate with the new team. Question 4. Which of the following Scrum events represent an opportunity for the Scrum to change the definition of done? The options are: this is not possible after the first sprint. Creating and updating the definition of done is possible only at the beginning of the project. The sprint review, the sprint planning, in the pause between the sprint, after any release sprint, sprint retrospective. I'm holding for 1 minute. Think before we move to the answer. Answer is the sprint retrospective. From the Scrum Guide 2020, the Scrum team inspects how the last sprint went with regards to individuals, interactions, processes, tools, and the definition of done. The Scrum team identify the most helpful changes to improve its effectiveness. Next question. A senior product manager within the organization asks the developers for a detailed status report for the current sprint. The developers go to the Scrum Master for the advice. What should the Scrum Master do? The options are: first one, nothing, as there are no project managers in Scrum. Second, coach the development team in self management. Third, ask the developers to add any work needed to create the report to the sprint backlog so that it is transparent how their time was spent during the sprint. Fourth, the Scrum Master should explain to the product manager how Scrum works and that progress can be asserted by inspecting the product increment during the sprint review meeting. Holding this video for one more minute. Answer: as Scrum Master, main responsibility to coach everyone about the Scrum in the organization. So, Scrum Master should explain to the product manager how Scrum works and that the progress can be asserted by inspecting the product increment during the sprint review meeting. Next question. During which Scrum event is work distributed and individual developers take ownership of one or multiple product backlog items? Options are: first, daily Scrum; second, sprint planning; third, never. All developers owns the product backlog items in the sprint. Fourth, as needed, when a developer is available, they'll claim and own the item from the sprint backlog. So now it's time for you to think. Answer is never. All the developers own the product backlog items in the sprint. The Scrum Guide 2020 explains developers are the people in the Scrum team that are committed to creating any aspect of a usable increment each sprint. While a single developer may work on an item alone, all developers are accountable for the outcome. Next question. Which of the following is the responsibility that the developers have? Options are: first, measuring and increasing velocity; second, sending a daily report to the product owner and stakeholders with the current status and impediments; third, pulling items from the product backlog into the sprint backlog; fourth, ordering the product backlog. Holding the video for 1 minute. Answer is pulling items from the product backlog into the sprint backlog. The Scrum Guide 2020 explains through discussion with the product owner, the developers select items from the product backlog to include in the current sprint. Next question. Who is responsible for monitoring the progress of work during the sprint? Options are: the product owner, the most senior developer, the Scrum Master, the developers. Each developer is responsible for the product backlog items owned. It's your time to think before we move to the answer. Answer is the developers. A Scrum team is a self-managing team, so developers themselves are responsible for monitoring the progress of the work during the sprint. Next question. When does the next sprint start? Options: immediately after the previous sprint has ended. Typically, a sprint will end on a Wednesday and the next sprint will start on Monday. The time between the sprints can be used to refine the product backlog and to write tests. Third, when the product owner has enough items in the product backlog to fill the entire sprint. Fourth, as soon as testing is done and the product increment adheres to the definition of done. Your time to think before we proceed. Answer is immediately after the previous sprint has ended. Scrum Guide 2020 explains a new sprint starts immediately after the conclusion of the previous sprint. Next question. An inexperienced product owner is unsure about sizing in Scrum and has asked the Scrum Master for help. How should the Scrum Master respond? Options are advise the product owner to make an effort to size the work in the product backlog and reassure that sizing will get better in time. Second, advise the product owner to size item using t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large, XL, instead of story point, as it's easier to get started. Third, inform the product owner that Scrum requires sizing in story points. Fourth, coach the product owner that developers are responsible for sizing. Ask the product owners to collaborate with the developers. They'll help the product owner understand how to estimate the product backlog alone. It's your time to think. Answer is coach the product owner that developers are responsible for sizing. Scrum Guide 2020 explains the developers who will be doing the work are responsible for sizing. Next question. Two Scrum team works on the same product. How should work be selected during the sprint planning meeting? Options are first, each team should pull work in collaboration with the product owner. Second, the product owner will distribute the work between the two teams. Third, the product owner should create a separate product backlogs for each team. Fourth, each team has a product owner, a product backlog, and the work is selected from the product backlog. Fifth, the Scrum team with a higher velocity should have priority in selecting the highest order product backlog items. Answer is each team should pull work in collaboration with the product owner. Next question. The definition of done can guide the developers during the sprint planning meeting in creating a forecast. True or false? Answer true. The definition of done guides the developers in knowing how many product backlog items it can select during the sprint planning. The Scrum Guide 2020 explains selecting how much can be completed within the sprint may be challenging. However, the more the developers know about their past performance, their upcoming capacity, and the definition of done, the more confident they will be in the sprint forecast. Next question. Which of the topics should be discussed during sprint review meeting? Options are the implementation of the Scrum framework during the sprint, development best practices with example from the sprint, sprint outcome, all of the above, none of the above. Answer is sprint outcome. The sprint outcome is product increment created during the sprint. Sprint review is held at the end of the sprint to inspect the product increment. Next question. The developers didn't complete the selected product backlog item by the end of the sprint. What happened next? Options are the sprint continues past the time box until all the work is done. Total time needed to complete the work will be the next sprint time box. Second, the Scrum Master can extend the sprint past the time box and ensures that root cause is identified during the sprint retrospective. Third, the Scrum team learns what is possible within the sprint time box and uses the experience in future sprint. Fifth, the product owner will question the developer to help identify who is responsible for missing the deadline. Answer is Scrum team learns what is possible within the sprint time box and uses the experience in future sprints. When the time box expires, the sprint will end. Scrum team will use this opportunity to learn more and to improve its forecast in future sprints. Which of the following is a typical output from the daily Scrum meeting? Options are first, a revised and achievable sprint goal based on the progress to date. Second, a sprint report for the product owner and stakeholders. Third, an updated Scrum board to make progress visible to the product owner and the stakeholders. Fourth, a daily status report from each developer. Fifth, a common understanding of how the sprint is progressing and what needs to be done next to meet the sprint goal. Answer is a common understanding of how the sprint is progressing and what needs to be done next to meet the sprint goal. The daily Scrum is a key inspect and adapt meeting. The developers need to have shared understanding of how things are going and make changes if needed. Next question. A good example of self-managing Scrum team is that Scrum Master is no longer needed. True or false? Answer is false. A Scrum Master is not optional in a Scrum team. Next question. Who manages the sprint backlog? Options: the developers, the lead developer, the product owner, the Scrum Master, the entire Scrum team. Answer: the developers. Scrum Guide 2020 explains the sprint backlog is a plan by and for the developers. Consequently, the sprint backlog is updated throughout the sprint as more is learned. It should have enough detail that they can inspect their progress in the daily Scrum. Next question. Three Scrum teams work on the same product. How does this situation affect the definition of done? Options. Each Scrum team has the liberty to define their own definition of done. The only requirement is to make it transparent to the other teams. Second, each Scrum team has the liberty to define their own definition of done. Any difference between them should be discussed during the integration sprint to ensure the integrated product increment. Third, it depends on the industry. Fourth, all the Scrum team share the same definition of done. This ensures that any increment created during the sprint are done and releasable. Answer. All the Scrum teams share the same definition of done. This ensures that any increment created during the sprint are done and releasable. The Scrum Guide 2020 explains if there are multiple Scrum teams working together on a product, they must mutually define and comply with the same definition of done. Without a shared definition of done, there's no guarantee that the product increment is realizable. Individual Scrum team may choose to apply more strict criteria. Next question. Complete the following sentence. Self-managing team choose. Options. How best to accomplish the work, the length of the sprint, which stakeholder to invite at the sprint review meeting, the next release date, the order of the product backlog. Answer: how best to accomplish their work. The Scrum Guide 2020 explained Scrum teams are also self managing, meaning they internally decide who does what, when, and how. Last question. As the sprint progresses, the developers notice that it will not be able to finish the selected product backlog items by the end of the sprint. In order to meet the sprint goal, with whom should they collaborate to modify the sprint backlog? Options are product owner and stakeholder, second, rest of the Scrum team, third, product owner, fourth, product owner and at least one project manager responsible for the project, fifth, Scrum master, sixth, nobody else, they can decide this on their own. Seventh, the sprint backlog can no longer change once the sprint has started. Answer is product owner. In this scenario, it's best for the developers to collaborate with the product owner. The Scrum Guide 2020 explains that scope may be clarified and renegotiated with the product owner as more is learned. Thanks you for all watching this video. If any questions, please ask me in the comment box. If you didn't subscribe yet, please do it. If you like this video, please like and share. For the latest notification of the related videos, please press bell icon. See you all with the next set of practice questions.